The Pacific Ocean, in those early months of the war, was a place that seemed too large to be real. It stretched in every direction like an endless mirror of blue, swallowing horizons and distances whole. Islands were scattered across it like seeds thrown by a careless hand, small, silent, lonely. And yet those islands, insignificant on a map, would become the beating heart of a conflict that was as vast as the ocean itself. It was here, above these islands and in the open skies between them, that a machine would make its name, not because it was indestructible, but because of what happened when it was struck. The Japanese called the aircraft the Mitsubishi G4M. To them it was a symbol of reach. A bomber that could cross oceans. To the Americans who fought it, it earned another name. The Betty. At first, there was no reason to think of it as anything unusual. The Americans had seen bombers before, big-bodied, loud-engine machines that carried destruction in their bellies. The B-17, the B-25, the British Wellingtons and Lancasters, these were weapons of endurance and force. But the Betty was different. It moved with an unnatural smoothness, its wings stretched long, its engines tuned to efficiency rather than brute strength. It did not lumber. It glided. When a formation of Betty bombers appeared on the horizon, they looked almost serene. The sunlight traced the curve of their wings. Their fuselages flashed like polished silver. They flew in tight formation, disciplined and deliberate, as if guided by an invisible thread. They did not look like something meant for killing. But appearances in war were rarely honest. The reason the Betty existed at all went back farther than the war itself, to a time when Japan was preparing for a conflict it believed to be inevitable. The Pacific was wide. Their empire was spread thin. Their navy needed eyes and their armies needed reach. They needed a bomber that could take off from an island hundreds of miles from anything and still strike a target with precision. They needed a machine that could fly farther than any bomber had flown before. And to achieve that, sacrifices were made. Sacrifices that would not be fully understood until the sky itself revealed them. The engineers removed armor plating, because armor made planes heavy. They removed self-sealing fuel tanks, because the rubber lining used in them added weight. They designed the frame thin, the skin light, the structure elegant, but fragile. What they built was a bomber that could cross great distances, but could not withstand injury. A bullet that struck the wrong place did not simply damage a Betty. It ignited it. This truth would only be discovered in blood and flame. The first time American pilots encountered Bettys in force was not in a grand battle at sea, but in the humid, aching air above the Solomon Islands, where the war seemed to hang thick like mist. The Americans were tired. Their planes were worn. Henderson Field on Guadalcanal was little more than a scar of brown dirt carved out of jungle. Every plane that landed kicked dust into the air so thick that mechanics coughed for hours afterward. The men stationed there did not yet know what the Betty was. But they were about to learn. Radar picked up dots, small, clustered, moving fast. Incoming aircraft. Distance closing. The alarm sounded. The pilots ran. Boots against dirt. Hands pulling on flight gear. Engines coughing awake. Propellers chopping the heavy air. The Wildcats, the American fighters, rose from the ground like fierce steel insects, engines roaring with the kind of desperate energy that exhaustion can't kill, only sharpen. They climbed. Higher. Higher still. And then they saw them. Dozens of Betty bombers, sunlight gleaming off metal, engines humming in unified rhythm. To the Americans watching from above, they appeared like a flock of birds migrating. Smooth. Measured. Beautiful. For a moment, just a moment, there was silence. No gunfire. No engines screaming in attack. Just two formations of aircraft watching each other across open sky. Then the orders came. And war resumed. The Americans dove. The Wildcats accelerated, engines howling, guns armed. They aimed for the rear of the formation, the standard approach to break a bomber group's cohesion. Tracer fire lanced across the sky. The Betty gunners returned fire in bright, glowing streaks. One American pilot, Lieutenant Harry Adams, lined up the tail of the nearest Betty. He exhaled, slow, steady, trained, and squeezed the trigger. A short burst. Just a heartbeat of gunfire. What happened next did not seem possible. The bomber did not shudder. It did not trail smoke. It did not falter. It ignited. The flame erupted from the wing, violent and sudden, like a torch catching oil. It spread in an instant, racing along the metal skin, consuming paint, fuel, and oxygen. The bomber became a sphere of fire. There was no time for the pilots inside to react. No time to correct. No time to hope. It fell from the sky like a dying star. Adams pulled away, stunned. He had fired only a few seconds. He had expected damage. But what he saw was annihilation. He radioed. They burn, one hit and they burn. But the sky around him was too loud for all. More Bettys. More gunfire. More fire blooming in the blue. As one pilot later said, it was like watching lanterns dropped from the heavens. The sky did not remain silent after the first Betty fell. The formation tightened, the Japanese crews reacting with discipline born of training and necessity. The bomber gunners swung their weapons toward the attackers, their tracers piercing the air like burning needles. The Americans kept pressing. They had seen what a single burst could do, and that knowledge carried a weight that was equal parts advantage and horror. If the Betty was struck anywhere near its fuel tanks, it didn't simply go down, it ceased to exist. One fighter pilot later said it was the first time he understood how thin the line was between machine and coffin. The Bettys continued forward, maintaining their mission. They had been ordered to strike American ships anchored offshore. The pilots knew the risks. They had known them long before this day. The Japanese airmen had a saying, quiet and resigned, if fire touches us, we are already ghosts. The crews inside the bombers felt every vibration of the engines. They heard the air rushing past the fuselage. They knew exactly where their fuel tanks were, not protected, not armored, only metal pressed around gasoline. They also knew why. Their commanders had explained it. To fly farther, to reach across the ocean, to strike where no one else could, that was the priority. Armor would have made the aircraft heavy. Self-sealing tanks would have consumed space and weight. The engineers had chosen range. The crews paid for it. And yet they flew, because that was the nature of war. The Americans descended again and again. Each burst of machine gun fire traced lines of light across the sky. One burst struck another Betty near the wing root. There was no transition, no slow collapse. It simply became fire. A diving comet of flame, falling in silence, extinguished only when it hit the ocean. But not all Bettys were lost. Some pressed on, breaking through the fighter screen. One bomber aligned its nose with an American destroyer below. The torpedo dropped, its metal body slicing into the sea like a shark disappearing into dark water. The American sailors on the deck below shouted and scattered as the torpedo churned the ocean white before striking the hull. A column of water rose into the air. The ship shuddered. Men fell to the deck. Smoke billowed. Above them, the bomber that had released the torpedo was already burning, hit by defensive guns from the ship. It went down in flames, but its mission was complete. The Japanese pilots had been trained to accept such outcomes. They did not expect to return. The Americans watching from above saw the contradiction clearly. The Betty could deal death, but could not survive receiving even a taste of it. Over the following weeks, the pattern repeated again and again. Betty formations approached. The Americans scrambled. The skies turned into battlegrounds of fire, metal, smoke, and falling streaks of burning debris. Word began to spread among American pilots, not as a report, not as a technical briefing, but as something spoken in quiet voices across mess halls and airstrips. aim for the wings. Just a few rounds. They'll go up. It was not excitement. It was not triumph. It was recognition of a tragic flaw turned into a tactical truth. On the Japanese side, the truth was also recognized. Reports flowed back to the designers and strategists. Pilots wrote in their journals that their lives felt borrowed, fragile, as if the aircraft itself reminded them that they were not meant to live long. Some recommended adding armor. Others recommended flying lower, at night, or with heavier escort. But Japan did not have the luxury of redesign. The factory lines were already pressed to capacity. The war was expanding faster than materials could be replaced. And so the Betty continued flying, fast, far, and fatally vulnerable. The skies of the Pacific became stages for tragedy. American pilots would later say they felt a strange guilt watching Bettys burn. Not regret, war did not allow that, but recognition of the humanity inside those falling flames. They knew that inside every burning bomber were men who had laughed, fought, loved, and feared just as they did. But the war did not slow. The Bettys kept coming. And the Americans kept firing. Because that was the only way the men on the ground, on the ships, and on the islands would survive. The sky had no room for mercy. Only fire. The understanding of the Betty's vulnerability spread across American squadrons until it became instinct. New pilots did not have to learn it through experience. They were told before their first combat flight, if you see a Betty, don't waste ammunition. Aim steady. 2 seconds. That's all it takes. It became so expected that some pilots, in their later recollections, said the sight of a Betty catching fire didn't shock them after a while. It simply happened, like a law of gravity. But the shock never faded for the men inside the bombers. Every time they took off, they felt the weight of invisible fuel sloshing around them. They did not speak about it aloud, it was considered disrespectful to fate, but every flight carried a quiet awareness that they were traveling inside a spark waiting to happen. Yet the Betty continued to play a critical role in Japan's war strategy. The Pacific Theater had no highways, no railroads connecting distant outposts. The ocean was the road, and the Betty was the vehicle that could cross it. When Japanese commanders needed to strike a distant island, resupply an isolated garrison, or coordinate naval operations, they sent Bettys. They became scouts, messengers, attackers, lifelines. Their ranges allowed them to appear over places the Americans thought were out of reach. For a time, this unpredictability made the Betty feared. But fear is a temporary advantage. Knowledge is permanent. The Americans learned, where the fuel tanks were located, how the plane reacted under stress, the angle from which a Betty had the least ability to defend itself. The Japanese gunners did what they could. They fired until their barrels glowed. Some Bettys did manage to shoot down attackers. There were instances where American pilots dove too predictably, underestimated the resolve of the men inside the blazing aircraft, and paid for it with their lives. No one walked away from the Pacific skies thinking the enemy was weak. Only that the machines they flew were shaped by different philosophies. The Japanese believed reach won wars. The Americans believed survival did. Both were correct, in their own ways. But the war favored endurance. As months passed, the skies shifted. The Americans introduced newer fighters, the F-4U Corsair, the P-38 Lightning, aircraft with more power, more range, more speed than the older Wildcats. The Bettys, meanwhile, remained the same. Their vulnerability became more pronounced. Encounters that once involved risk turned into hunts. Formations that once broke through with torpedoes and bombs were now intercepted long before they reached their targets. The Bettys still flew with discipline. Still held formation. Still aimed for ships with deadly intent. But the flames came faster now. The Americans watched from above as the ocean reflected the burning wreckage. The water below became a mirror for falling fire. Not every Betty mission ended in tragedy. Some succeeded. Some sank ships. Some returned. But the number that did not return grew larger. Airfields in Rabaul, Truk, and the marshals began to feel emptier. Crews rotated faster. Pilots with experience became fewer. And still the missions continued, because Japan could not afford to stop them. There were still islands to defend, seas to control, fronts to hold back. The Pacific does not forgive distance. And without Bettys to cross those distances, Japan's foothold began to erode. The very range that made the aircraft necessary also doomed the men who flew it. But the Americans did not celebrate. They saw the flames. They saw the falling shadows. They heard the radio calls that cut into static before ending abruptly. They knew what it meant to be human inside a machine that could kill you as quickly as your enemy could. They did not speak about mercy. They did not speak about grief. They spoke about fuel tanks, angles, approach speeds. But in the quiet moments, on the ground, after missions, some pilots admitted they could still see the burning silhouettes when they closed their eyes. War forces understanding. And understanding changes memory. The Betty was never hated. It was respected. And feared. And mourned. It was a weapon built for distance in a war that rewarded endurance. The flames told the rest. The Japanese crews who flew the Betty began to develop habits that were never written in manuals. Small rituals to acknowledge the danger they lived inside. Some pilots placed small charms or folded letters inside the cockpit, tucked beside the throttle or under the seat. Some touched the fuselage before boarding, as if offering a silent pact between themselves and the metal shell that held their fate. They rarely discussed fear openly, but it was present as a constant companion. The moment the engine started and the propellers spun to life, the thin skin of the aircraft vibrated, reminding them of its fragile construction. They could hear fuel shifting within the tanks, a sound few other aviators in the war ever experienced so directly. It was a whisper of vulnerability that followed them into the sky. And yet they flew. Because orders required it. Because honor demanded it. Because their comrades would take their place if they did not. The commanders expected total commitment. The men gave it. They did not view themselves as victims of design. They viewed themselves as necessary. Each mission carried a purpose greater than survival. But that purpose grew harder to see as losses increased. Letters home became less frequent. Many families received notices but no bodies, only the statement that their sons had vanished over the sea. The ocean does not return what it takes. Meanwhile, the Americans were studying the Betty in detail. Whenever a crashed bomber could be recovered, whether from jungle wreckage or shallow reef, intelligence teams examined it. They traced bullet holes along the wing structure, mapped how fuel had spread, analyzed how quickly fire had consumed the aircraft. The conclusion was always the same. The bomber's strength, its long range, came at the cost of survivability. It was not a flaw of craftsmanship. It was intentional. The aircraft did exactly what it was designed to do. But the war it was designed for shifted. The Japanese engineers had imagined a war of swift, decisive strikes across the Pacific, fast offensives, rapid territorial gains, no extended attrition. The Betty was built for that war. But the war they found themselves in was grinding, prolonged, relentless. A war of supply lines, island by island fighting, and incremental advantage. A war in which the side that endured longest would prevail. The Betty could strike. But it could not endure. And endurance was what the Pacific demanded. American pilots did not need heavy ammunition to bring one down. Even small-caliber rounds, if they struck the fuel tanks or fuel lines, resulted in fire spreading faster than any crew could contain. The Betty was not given self-sealing tanks, and without them, flames moved like a living creature. Some gunners tried to extinguish the fires mid-flight. Some pilots attempted steep dives to suffocate the flame with lack of airflow. Some tried shutting off engines quickly to starve fuel flow. None of it worked. Fire in a Betty was death. The Japanese Air Command understood the situation but could not change course. The industrial capacity they possessed was already stretched thin. Their naval supply lines were under constant pressure. The ships they relied upon were being lost. The factories that produced aircraft could not afford to stop building one model and retool for another. The war was tightening. Time was shrinking. And the Betty, for all its vulnerability, remained one of the few weapons still capable of reaching far into the Pacific. So the missions continued. Day raids. Night raids. Long-range reconnaissance. Torpedo runs against American fleets. Search and rescue flights for downed Japanese crews. Ironically, even rescue missions were flown in burning-prone aircraft. The men who flew the Betty became used to the idea that every takeoff carried the weight of finality. They lived with the knowledge that a single spark, a single tracer, a single fragment of metal could transform sky into fire. Yet they flew, not as martyrs, but as soldiers. Because the war still needed them. Because the ocean was wide. Because the sky was the only road left. The American pilots had trained for years on how to keep their guns steady, how to track a target through vibration and wind, how to predict where an enemy aircraft would be a second later. But nothing prepared them for the emotional shock of realizing they were not fighting a plane built to withstand them. They were fighting something that felt fragile, something that almost seemed too easy to destroy. In one of the early encounters over Guadalcanal, Lieutenant James Red Murphy looked through his gun sight and actually hesitated. He saw the Betty bomber gliding steady and smooth, its long wings glowing under the Pacific sun, the big red circles on the sides bright like targets painted by fate. He saw the fuel tanks bulging behind the thin aluminum skin, reflecting the light. And he remembered what the instructors said: Japanese planes are built for range, not survival. He squeezed the trigger anyway. The first burst hit the bomber's wing. And instantly, almost unbelievably, the entire airplane erupted into flame. Not a slow burn. Not a steady fire. A violent whoosh, like gasoline thrown onto a campfire. The bomber didn't break apart gracefully. It became a comet, spiraling into the ocean in less than 10 seconds. Murphy didn't cheer. He didn't pump his fist. He didn't feel triumphant. He sat in his cockpit stunned. He had just killed men who probably knew what would happen to them the moment American fighters showed up. It was at that moment many U.S. pilots realized something frightening. These bombers weren't just vulnerable. They were practically built to burn. And the Japanese bomber crews, they knew it too. Yet they flew anyway. That was the part that stuck with everyone who fought them. Because that kind of courage is hard to understand. Hard to respect. Hard to accept. But it was real. The Betty was fast and elegant in the air, but inside, it was cramped and exposed. There were only thin sheets of metal between the crew and death. No extra armor. No self-sealing tanks. No reinforcement plates. If a bullet entered, there was nothing to stop it from tearing through wires, fuel lines, hydraulics, and skin. Imagine sitting in that cockpit, knowing that a single tracer round could ignite everything around you. No escape. Some of the bomber crews would tuck small good luck charms behind their panels. Others carried family pictures taped beside the controls. Some had letters folded carefully into pockets, letters they'd never sent, because they weren't sure anyone would ever read them. They knew what their plane was. They knew what it meant to fly it. And yet, As the war continued, American pilots began to notice patterns. Betty bombers often flew in tight formation, not because it was tactically perfect, but because the crews felt safer that way. There was something deeply human in that, fear disguised as discipline. They also noticed how the bombers approached their targets. Betty crews pushed their aircraft low over waves, skimming the surface so closely that their shadows danced on the water. Then, when they neared a U.S. ship, the pilot would pull up sharply, sometimes too sharply, trying to aim the torpedo drop perfectly. One pilot later recalled seeing a Betty's pilot clearly through the cockpit glass during a pass. He said the man looked calm, focused, almost peaceful. And then the bomber exploded under fire, disappearing into flame before the torpedo even fell. The image haunted him for the rest of his life. Over time, U.S. air crews went from shock, to confidence, to something more complicated. At first, their planes are weak. We have the advantage. But later, they fly those weak planes on purpose. They were not reckless fools. They were not ignorant. They were not forced. They believed in what they were doing. The war turned the Betty bomber from a machine into a symbol. Speed over safety. Duty over survival. Sacrifice over self. And every pilot on both sides of the Pacific skies understood what that meant. In the end, the story of the Betty bomber is not simply the story of an airplane. It is the story of two different views of war, two different philosophies of what mattered when a nation was fighting for its future. The Americans came to the Pacific with machines built to survive. Their aircraft were heavier, reinforced, armored, self-sealing, and tested to withstand punishment. Their doctrine emphasized bringing pilots home, because trained pilots were valuable. Every life saved meant a future mission flown. Every pilot who returned brought experience, wisdom, and skill back to the squadron. The Japanese came with a different vision. Their machines were built to reach far, to strike unexpectedly across the vast ocean, to hit enemies who did not expect them, to project power where none had existed before. They valued range and speed over survival. They valued the effect of a mission more than the survival of the crew flying it. In their culture of that era, sacrifice in service to the nation was considered honorable. Returning home alive was not necessarily the highest measure of duty. The Betty bomber, with its long graceful wings and exposed fuel tanks, embodied that idea perfectly. As the war progressed, both sides changed, adapted, and hardened. The Americans learned to attack Betty bombers from angles where their fuel tanks were most vulnerable. They learned to use altitude and speed to dictate engagements. They refined their tactics while their planes became tougher and more heavily armed. Meanwhile, Japanese bomber crews became even more aware of the risks they carried into every mission. Some crews began flying with extra fire extinguishers. Some wrapped makeshift padding around fuel pipes. Some even carried buckets of sand, as though sand could stop what bullets and flames would do. But most of all, they carried acceptance. Quiet, heavy acceptance. They knew what could happen. They simply flew anyway. There is a common image in historical books, the Betty bomber exploding in the sky, fire blazing out from the wings, the aircraft spiraling downward in a trail of flame. It is dramatic. It is violent. But what the image does not show is the silence inside the cockpit before the engagement, the moments when the crew sat breathing together, listening to the engines hum, knowing that every mission could be their last. The Americans watching these planes burn sometimes felt triumph. Sometimes relief. But often, something more complicated. You cannot watch another human being choose death and feel nothing. Many pilots would later say that the first time they saw a Betty erupt in flame, they realized that the men inside were just that, men. Not monsters. Not faceless enemies. Men who had families, memories, small joys, hopes, fears. Men who were taught, just like the Americans were taught, that they were serving something greater than themselves. And that is the quiet tragedy of the Betty bomber. It was not a bad airplane. It was a remarkable airplane, one of the first long-range bombers in the Pacific capable of reaching targets thousands of miles away. It allowed Japan to strike quickly, deeply, unpredictably. It shocked the world at the start of the war. Its capabilities were impressive, even elegant, in their simplicity and purpose. But war is not elegant. War demands survival. Endurance. Permanence. The Betty bomber gave its crews wings, but not protection. It gave them reach, but not longevity. It could take them into battle, but not back home again. As the tide of the war turned, the Betty became even more symbolic of Japan's desperation. Missions grew more dangerous. Airfields grew fewer. Experienced pilots were replaced by young men barely trained. And yet, the missions continued, the torpedo runs, the night raids, the supply flights to isolated islands. Each one a gamble. Each one a choice. Some of the final missions flown by Betty bombers were not bombing raids at all. They were diplomatic flights carrying envoys to discuss surrender. When the final treaty was signed and the war came to a close, some of the last surviving Betty bombers were flown to airfields and burned intentionally, their frames collapsing to the earth in silence. Not destroyed by gunfire, but retired by the very nation that built them. Their usefulness was over. Their era had ended. But the memory remained. For the American pilots who fought them, the Betty bomber came to represent the strange duality of war, the part that is brutal and the part that is human. The part that demands victory and the part that remembers the cost. For the Japanese crews who flew them, the Betty symbolized courage, sacrifice, and unshakable duty, even in the face of near-certain death. And for history, the Betty bomber remains a reminder that sometimes the machines built for war say more about the people who built them than any speech, book, or monument ever could. Speed. Range. Purpose. Vulnerability. And courage in spite of all of it. That is the legacy of the Betty bomber.